Welcome back to Introduction to Psychology. So today we will continue Chapter 2 and we'll talk about ethical guidelines for research and then some basic, we'll end with some basic statistics. So if you want to do a study in psychology and publish it in an academic journal, you must have the study approved by a research ethics board at your institution. If you do a study without that approval, then you can't go publish it in an academic journal. You can still go publish it on Medium, but in order to get anywhere in academia, you need to publish in the academic journals. So there was a time when there were no research ethics boards, and that was a time when we did research in social psychology, like the Milgram experiments and the Robbers Cave experiments that we cite a lot but could never conduct again. So when, let's say, you become an honors student and you're going to do your own study, you will have to go through a process of having it approved. And you'll have to consider, are there any risks to your subjects? Could there be any harm? And you'll have to get the informed consent of your participants. Now, that's not true for sort of naturalistic observation. You as a member of the public can go to a park and watch people and count the number of times they give each other hugs. So there's some conditions where you don't have to get research ethics. If you're looking at published data and you're doing a systematic review, then you don't need to get ethics for that. But if you're going to do a study on people, bring them into a lab, make them do something, ask them questions that could be invasive, where they put themselves at risk because you could violate their privacy, then you do have to have ethical approval for that and their informed consent. So when you participate in a study at Mount Allison, one of the first things that will happen is that you should be given a form to read through. And usually it's like 5-10 pages long even. And that explain. Oh, sorry, someone has their microphone on. Sorry. I'm not sure who has their microphone on. Okay. I'm just going to hit mute all. There we go. Okay, back to, let me open the chat again so I can see your messages. There we go. All right. So back to informed consent. So you'll read through that form and it should explain lots of things to you. It should explain the purpose of the study, right? How long you'll be in there for. Are there any potential risks? Could you be harmed in any way? Okay. And then you can voluntarily choose to participate. And you have the right to withdraw at any time, to say, no, I'm not going to do this. Now, looking at the informed consent, do you see anything there that could, say, mess with your research, or I want to say create a confound, but I don't think those aren't the right words, because it would be the same between the treatment and the control group. And for something to be a confound, it has to be different for the treatment or the control group. But is there anything there that could throw off your experiment, that could be inconvenient for you as an experimenter? Well, having your participants be able to walk out could be inconvenient, but anything else there? Research participants should be fully informed of the purpose of the research, its expected duration, any potential risks, discomfort, or adverse effects. And I see a comment there. If you say, for example, that they might be uncomfortable or bored, then they will anticipate those aspects. That's what I'm getting at. And I'm also getting at it through so yes, and you saw that in a different way than I saw it. I think you're right. Yeah. Oh, you could expect to be bored. I don't really want to do this, and then maybe actually act bored. Okay. So yes, and it's the same thing here with if you're fully informed of the purpose of the research. Well, then are you going to tell them your hypothesis? And then there is a question from Shirley. When did this become a rule? Because if I'm remembering correctly, the Stanford prison experiment didn't allow participants to withdraw at any time, but that was a while ago. Yeah, so the Stanford prison experiment is one of those famous experiments in social psychology, like the Robbers Cave experiment, like the Milgram experiment. And it showed that when you randomly assigned people to either be the prison guards or the prisoners in a fake little prison that they ran in the basement of the psychology department, the people who were randomly assigned to be the guards started acting really abusively. And so there's a few experiments like that shows that just giving people privilege and power makes them act in ways that are very cruel, because when you create that inequality and you put someone on a pedestal and make them the boss and in charge, then you're also dehumanizing the other group. So it was a beautiful experiment, but not very fun for the people who were randomly assigned to the prisoner. And imagine if you're participating in this because you're like a psychology student, and these are your professors, so you feel like you have to go along with it. They're sticking your head in the toilet and stepping on you, and yeah. So because things like that happened, and because people made a stink about it, that's why ethical review boards became a thing. And I'm not sure what date that would have been, but I'm going to guess 1970s ish. We could look that up. I don't know. There's some question there about about the story. Did something happen to the researcher? And I'm not sure. I think it was reported by the researcher's girlfriend, who's another very famous psychologist. She's the one that did the burnout research. Maslow's, is it? No, it's not Maslow. That's the wrong word. Maslach, Christina Maslach. So
yeah, we learned about this. We learned about this. I had taken a psychology course in a college, and we were learning about this. If this is the right one I was thinking about, I think the researcher ended up like trapping them there as well, and not letting it stop, and not telling people on the outside what was going on, because he was like, he was too focused on the thing, and he almost became like the warden and stuff like that. So it affected him as well with his biases. That's the one I was thinking of, because I know there was something like the researcher had, like, it affected him in ways, and it ended up getting really bad.
He got drawn into it. Wow, that's amazing. So you should, as the experimenter, being to try to anticipate, try to think about how your research could harm people, and then take reasonable steps to avoid that harm. Sometimes deception is used, because if people knew your hypothesis, it would kind of ruin everything for you. But there's rules around that too. Okay, so you have to inform them of the deception as soon as possible after it takes place. So here's an example of where we might use deception is, let's say we want to study altruism and helping. So maybe a research assistant poses as someone else, and poses as a member of a public, and they pretend to have like a sort of a heart attack or some medical event, and we're going to see if you go help them. But you don't know that it's an actor, but you would be told after, right, the end of the study. And so there's rules around that, and so you have to debrief them. So at the end of the study, there should always be a debrief. So once the person has participated, when you go in and you participate in these experiments, you should be debriefed after, where they'll explain to you what they were doing and what they were trying to find out and what the hypothesis was. Okay. And if you were deceived, they will tell you then. And again, rules around deception, and you shouldn't be doing it in a way that would cause some kind of physical pain or emotional distress. Here's an example of an unethical study. And this is naturalistic observation. You could sort of say, well, isn't it okay to just observe? And the answer is no, because maybe you should be helping a person. So researchers wanted to know about what we call the natural history of syphilis. So the natural history of a disorder is basically, you know, what are the phases of this disorder? So let's say you have syphilis and it's untreated. How does that go for people? Do you have it for 5 years? Does it resolve itself? Do you have it for 20 years? And then, do you, at what point do you start? Does it affect your brain and you start getting dementia? That's neurosyphilis. And how many people on average do you spread it around to while you have it? Aren't those interesting questions? So researchers who wanted to know this found a very marginalized community of working class Black folks in the South. It'd be a lot of racism, especially at that time. And so they found men who were diagnosed who had syphilis. Like they had to do tests to find out who has syphilis, but they didn't tell the people who were positive who had syphilis that they had it. Okay, they sort of kept that secret, and they didn't treat them for the syphilis. They just observed them and watched what happens. And let's say come in every year for a checkup, and we'll see how you're doing. But the people who were interacting with the researchers would have thought that these are, medical personnel who care about their well-being, right? So the researchers did not infect them with syphilis. There was a base rate of syphilis in the community. They found out who had it, and they watched to see what would happen. But the researchers knew who had syphilis, and there's also a cure for it. And there's been a cure for it since like 1910. Actually, syphilis has is an important disease in the history of psychology, because it's the medical model was found. The medical model in psychology, the idea that you have an illness, right? What's wrong with behavior is an illness, is kind of based on what we learned from syphilis. At one time in history, sexual mores were much stricter, and part of that was because people, STIs were a thing, but people didn't really know what they were or what caused them. And syphilis was a major STI at one time. And as syphilis progresses, it affects the brain. That's called neurosyphilis. And you get all kinds of psychological symptoms, right? Because there's a disease affecting the brain, maybe causing swelling. And that can include disordered behavior and delusions and dementia. And so it was a big deal to figure out that was caused by a pathogen and that this could be cured. And that led to a whole lens and way of thinking in psychology that your disordered behavior is an illness. And we can go fix that illness and cure the illness. And you know what? I think that's very appropriate in some cases where there really is a kind of a low-level biological cause. But human behavior also reflects a lot of things. So the medical model isn't the only model we can use in psychology. It has its place. It's one of the lenses. So in this Tuskegee study, something that they did was track how many other people they infected, right? These men infected their wives, right? There were babies born with syphilis. That affects the child. Some of them, developed neurosyphilis and died early. And the researchers did nothing to save them, even though they collected the data. So that's a kind of a quiet way of being unethical, right? You can be unethical, you can act unethically even if you're not directly intervening, because you're not helping somebody you could help. Something that you'll see commonly on informed consent forms and on debrief forms is that the researchers will give you the contact information for mental health resources in your community, so that if you are in emotional distress or psychological distress, they give you a resource where you can get help. Interesting question from Chance. When a study is unethical, in retrospect, are they still able to use the findings? for the Stanford experiment versus this experiment, is it different? Because the unethical nature of the Stanford experiment might have been seen as corruptive to the data, whereas this is unethical in a way that wasn't inherently corrupt to the data. The Stanford experiment was well done, and we still cite it. Folks, the Nazis were very into experimental control and rigor, and they did experiments on folks in concentration camps that continued to be cited. So very tragically, Nazi scientists determined the exact sort of temperature at which, you can't recover from hypothermia. And that research continued to be cited. Yes, we do continue to cite the Robbers Cave experiments and the Milgram experiments, even though we can't replicate them. There are the APA format guide. I believe there's a section on how to do that. Like, you're supposed to mention that this is, so in the case of like Nazi research, I believe you're supposed to acknowledge where it came from. But yes, it is still cited. And a lot of the unethical research actually has really high internal validity. Like, that's why we cite it. Comment from Jane. I think it's important to note that the group for the prison experiment was exclusively white upper class men who volunteered for it. True. Yes, true. It doesn't remove the validity, but it does affect how universal its claims are. Yes, very good catch. And you can see what I'm doing, which is very normal in psychology, which is to sort of generalize the results that were done on a really small group to everyone everywhere. Same with the Robbers Cave experiment. Was all done on little white suburban boys. Then there's animal research. So about 8-ish% of research in psychology uses animals. About 4 million animals are used per year. When I was being trained, I worked with animals. The animals that are mostly used are rodents, like rats and mice, and birds are quite common too. And when psychologists do research on animals, it's not because they're really interested in animal psychology, right? I think that field might be called ethology. That would be a field of biology. Did my mic cut out? No, Chance, can you hear me?
I can hear you, so I don't know if he just needs to, or he or she, or they, just needs to exit and then come back in. Yeah, it seems like a lot of people can still hear you.
Awesome, good, great. Where was I? Okay, so the reason that we use animals in psychology is because you can do experiments on animals that you can't do on humans. So there are institutional ethical review boards for animals, where you still need ethical approval, but at the end of the study, you sacrifice the animals, okay? And that's approved. At the end of your study on humans, you can't sacrifice the humans, okay? So there's different standards. When the type of animal that we use in psychological research is a kind of animal that we feel comfortable generalizing from. So cats are used in research on vision. And that's because the cat's visual system is remarkably similar to the human visual system, even though cat's eyes look so different. But we wouldn't use fish for that kind of research. Okay, we wouldn't use fruit flies for that kind of research because fruit flies have compound eyes, and it'd be too hard to get in there. Rats are used for a lot of research on memory and learning, and birds, I'm not sure on the top of my head. I did research on addiction, and we did, there can be issues with generalizability. There was an effort in the lab I was working on to create a rat model of post-traumatic stress disorder. And there was a graduate student that was trying to traumatize the rats with a kind of water maze where the rats thought they were drowning. And the rats were very afraid in the fearful situation. But they never generalized the fear back to the home cage environment. So when they went back to the cages, they were fine. And in humans who have PTSD, they're outside of the fearful environment, but they're still scared and they're still reliving it. So that didn't seem to work with rats. Dogs were also used. Beagles, I think, more so. Yeah. So there's a question, why would we sacrifice them? Well, the reason is because once you've done an experiment with a certain animal, it now has a memory of that. And that if you use that animal in another study, that might somehow mess up your results. You're going to have the highest level of experimental control if it's kind of a fresh subject. So that is why. Sometimes they're used in multiple studies, and the rats might live for, months and months. Sometimes they find homes for the animals. Like sometimes people will sneak animals out of the lab and adopt them if they kind of like one of them. There's a few. I've seen a few people who have cats from the Dalhousie Visual Research Labs, and the cats are raised in these experiments were raised in the dark, and so their eyes don't develop properly, and they're kind of blind. So, I've known a couple of people that had those, but generally not. There's you're not allowed to release them either. So anyway, what I'm kind of communicating is that animals are used. The reason we use them is because there's much higher internal validity to the experiments. So, you can, when you're doing an experiment on animals, you can keep them in their cages and they all get the same amount of food and water and they don't do anything else. But you do an experiment on humans, they're doing all sorts of other things, right? And they can quit the experiment and they can be on their phone. So the reason is external validity, and there's a concern. Sorry, the reason is internal validity, experimental control, and there can be concerns about generalizability. And then there will always, at a university, there'll always be like an animal care person, and you do have to go through, there is ethical oversight. Why do we have institutional review boards for animal research? And that's because of the research by Harry Harlow, which was done on rhesus monkeys, and he was studying social deprivation. And so he took baby monkeys away from their mothers and watched them develop. He put them into isolation to see what that did to them. Really messes them up. That's a famous picture there, and it's kind of the cloth mother, wire mother experiment. And what he did was he tried to see, well, is the infant attached to the parent because of the food it's providing or because of the comfort? And so he made a kind of wire that's supposed to look like a monkey mother. One of them had milk, and then the other one was kind of soft cloth, and he wanted to see what the baby monkeys would do. And they sort of hung out with the softer one and then reached over to nurse on the wire one. He wanted to see, well, would they get more attached to the wire one because it's the one with the food? Yeah. And then, they were very upset, sort of neurotic monkeys. And then another thing that he learned was that you could get them back to normal functioning monkey. If you put them in a social group with adult monkeys, it was not good. But you could put them with younger monkeys, and then they could catch up. There's a question from Lynn. For any of those, wouldn't it be kind of unethical in many other senses? Sure. So there's people who are advocates for animal rights that are not very pleased with any of this, right? If you went to PETA and you said, is this ethical? They would say no. But people have different values. And, if you eat meat or you eat eggs or you eat dairy or you wear leather, then, an animal was used in that process. And so it's normal for us in human societies to use animals that way. Not all, there are different human societies with different norms and values. In Hindu culture, the things we do to cows here are not okay, right? And in this society and culture, we treat dogs very well in a way that really surprises outsiders who are like, what's going on? And we might be shocked by people eating dogs in China. There's a religious community, people called Jains. People who practice Jainism wear masks so that they don't even inhale a fly. So different cultures, different norms, different values, and in our culture, we do use animals, but we don't want to be too abusive, so there are limits on what you can do, right? And so there are rules around how animals are sacrificed, and it's yeah, you can't do anything you want. You can't Harry Harlow's research wouldn't be approved anymore, and it was because of the outrage around that these ethical review boards were established. All right, on to yes, and there's a comment from Chance that pigs are as smart as dogs, but we don't see pigs in the same way as we see dogs. And there's a question: how do you replicate, and for a lack of a better term, alter an experiment that was previously unethical? For example, the prison experiment wouldn't be an ethical one to recreate, but seeing as the volunteers were all part of a particularly privileged group, the results might be drastically different among other groups. Yeah, and so you want to be even more careful when you're working with a marginalized group. And these results could be important, but again, this experiment is atrocious, should never be replicated. This is just the only example I can think of, but how would you recreate an experiment in a more ethical manner? Well, another famous set of experiments were the Milgram experiments, and what Stanley Milgram did was create an experimental setup where you're the teacher and you're getting the student over there who's actually a confederate of the experimenter to learn something. Like you teach him some words and he's supposed to repeat them back. It's something like that. Anyway, if he's wrong, you have to give him a little electric shock. Okay. If he keeps being wrong, you dial up the shock. And what that series of experiments found, it's not one experiment, it's a series of experiments. And in the experiment, the shocks go all the way up to lethal. The percentage of people that will obey the experimenter and even to their own view kill the person, because now the person is a confederate of the experimenter. He's an actor, but he says, I have a heart condition. He asks for it to stop. He screams. He bangs on the wall. And it makes the research subject feel uncomfortable and say, well, should we really be doing this? But the experimenter is the authority figure. It says, yes, the experiment must continue. Okay. 75% of people will kill the other person for a stupid experiment. And I think that research was done in the 1960s. Stanley Milgram was wondering, how did people let these things happen to the Jews in the Second World War? And the answer, is because we have a tendency just to be obedient and do what we're told, even if what we're being told is obviously wrong. Now you could wonder, well, would people still do that? Have we changed? And so there have been alterations of Milgram's protocol. And I believe in one of them, they only put the shocks up to, not all the way to lethal, but to a certain point, because they knew from the original Milgram experiments that if anyone went beyond that point, 80% of them would proceed the whole way. So we're going to move the threshold down.
They also, they also replicated it, and they didn't put the shocks, but they had the actors act like they were getting shocked.
Yeah.
And it was after the fact that even though they were debriefed and said they weren't shocking some people still came out with emotional trauma because they believed it. So there was still some ethical issues with that, because it did end up affecting them emotionally and mentally at the end of the study.
And we hope that there would be resources or treatment for that, and that what we learned from the study would be of enough value that it accounts for that. And we use that argument with animal research. So even though we sort of sacrifice the animals and that's not their ideal life, they'd rather be outside running around free, we say, well, what we learn can save so many human lives. And right, there's a justification around, the value of what we learned. And these are all this is all philosophy, right? This is all moral philosophy. There's a large role for moral philosophy in psychology. On to statistics. It's kind of a sudden shift, ethics, statistics. There's some basic statistics that you need to know for psychology. And when we have scores on a trait, and let's take the example of age or height, you have a score for the trait of height. Okay, my score is 5 feet 4 inches, and yours might be that or a little different. And if we looked at everyone's scores, there'd be a distribution of scores. And it so happens that the average height of a female-bodied person in North America is 5'4", and I'm 5'4". So my height is the average height, and I don't have I have a deviation of 0 from that. But let's say that you are a female-bodied person and you are 5 foot 5 inches, well, then you have a deviation of 1 inch from the average. 5'2". So when we look at a distribution, we look at two things. We look at the sort of the center, where do most scores fall, and then we look at the spread. What's the range, and what's the deviation from the average? But there's 3 kinds of averages, and you probably learned these all in grade 12. When I was in grade 12, that's when we covered statistics. So one of them is the mean. And the mean is when you add up all the scores and you divide by the number of numbers. And that's one way to look at an average. Then there's the median. And the median is what you get when you line up all the scores from lowest to highest and you pick the middle number. Now, if you have an even number of numbers, there's going to be 2 numbers in the middle, and the way you deal with that is to average those 2 numbers, average using the mean. And then there's the mode, and the mode is the most frequently occurring number. So let's say that we looked at everyone's height score, and most of the people there were, and let's say there were 5 people who had a height of 5 feet 2 inches, and that was in a way the most popular single score. Even if that's not the mean or the median, that is a measure of center, of typicality, and that's called the mode. In a normal distribution, in that bell curve, the mean, median, and mode are all in kind of the same place. But not all distributions are normal distributions, and I've never seen a data set where even if there's a rough bell curve where it's like a perfect bell curve, usually there's some skew and the median isn't the same as the mean. It's important to think about what is the appropriate statistic to communicate something. In the case of income, so when Statistics Canada is reporting income, so let's say you want to find out, what do most people earn? They don't give you the mean, they give you the median. Why would they do that? So you want to look up the average income for people in Halifax, Nova Scotia. Go to Statistics Canada. They're not going to give you the mean. They're going to get, well, the mean will be there. You can find it, but what they communicate is the median. That's the one they put front and center.
Would it be because it would probably be a little bit higher because of the people that make astronomically amount of money?
Yes, yeah, and so you're right, and the Gabrielle is right as well. So let's say that in the population of people in Halifax, most people are earning, I don't know, $30,000, $40,000, but there's some super rich people here, right? There's a few really rich families that are old money and they own all the businesses, okay, and they're like millionaires. And so let's say you have a lot of people with an income of around 30,000, and then you throw in a few millionaires. Well, now the average, and you calculated the mean, well, now it would be like something like $100,000. And that is accurate. That would be you calculated the mean accurately, but communicating that would be misleading because it's not the typical experience. And so the median, the middle value, is a better measure in that, is a better measure of central tendency when there are outliers. So the median is the middle value, and it's not sensitive to the fact that the highest value is $1 million or $1 billion, right? But the mean is sensitive to that. That would pull the average. That would pull the mean out, right? If the highest value in your data set was 100,000 versus 1 million versus 1 billion, that value of the outlier would affect the calculation of the mean, but not the median. There's a question: does the minimum income affect it? It's also, the median is sensitive to very low scores or to very high scores. Sorry, the means are sensitive to outliers on either the very low or the very high end. So it works both ways. And the median is not resistant to outliers. And then we're also interested in spread. And one way we could look at spread is the range. So let's say I'm interested in knowing your ages. How old are the students in this class? Well, I'm going to guess that the youngest person is, let's say the youngest person is 18, and the oldest person is, I don't know, 40. 40 minus 18 is the range. Okay, that's the entire breadth, but it doesn't tell you where most people are falling. Okay, and so we also have the standard deviation. The standard deviation is related to the mean, and so the standard deviation is also sensitive to outliers. That's why it's nice to have both. The range measure, sorry, the measure of spread that goes along with the median is something called the interquartile range. I don't think you don't need to know that. And the interquartile range is saying, it's like, okay, so the median's the 50th percentile. Well, what's the 25th and what's the 75th? Where was I? Standard deviation. So the average height for women in North America is 5'4". I am 5'4". My deviation from that is 0. But if you're shorter or you're taller than that, then you might have a positive deviation score or a negative deviation score. If you're 5'2", then you have a negative deviation of 2 inches. And if you're 5'5", then you have a positive deviation of 1 inch. And we want to know what the average deviation is. We have a bit of a problem because if we average the negative and the positive scores, they cancel out. And we don't want that to suggest there was an average of no deviation, when in fact there is. And so we square the deviations as part of the computation of the standard deviation. I've talked about variance before, I think. That's kind of the amount of dispersion in your data. Variance is calculated in a way that isn't the same unit of measure as the mean is. And the standard deviation is a measure that goes along with the mean. And so we want to express it in the same kind of units. And in order to do that, we have to square root it. So the standard deviation is the square root of the variance. And we have to do that squaring to deal with the fact that there are negative and positive values. So we have to turn them into like an absolute difference. So this is the sort of typical normal distribution. Not all variables in psychology that we measure in psychology have this distribution, but it's a very, very common one. And it's called the normal distribution. And the idea here is that, let's say let me turn on my laser pointer. Say this is a score on some trait. And here they've standardized it so that, but pretend it isn't standardized, and let's say it's like IQ scores, and the average IQ is 100, and people get up to say about 150, and the lowest scores might be around 60 or something like that. And in a normal distribution, it's sort of symmetrical. The mean and the median fall in the same place. And the idea is that, I can't read that very well, but I think it's something like, so 64 or 68 percent of people fall within one standard deviation of the mean. So for IQ scores, the average IQ is 100, and 60, does that say 68? I think it does. I can't, the resolution is too poor. I'm pretty sure it's 68. So 68% of people will have a score that's within one standard deviation of the mean. The standard deviation is 15, so scores between 85 and 115. But if you have an IQ score of 130, that's another standard deviation above the mean. You're 2 standard deviations above the mean, and 95% of people fall within 2 standard deviations of the mean. A word we use in psychology a lot is normal. You know, what's normal and what's abnormal? And that can mean a lot of different things, but statistically, when we say that somebody's score is kind of in the normal range, it means that it's within that 95%. You're within 2 standard deviations of the mean. So my IQ score is in the normal range. I'm not a sort of super genius or anything like that. Okay? But then there's less and less people who have more and more extreme scores. So there's, a lot of people who have, an IQ of 100. That's the sort of the most people, but there'd be very, very few people who have super high scores or super low scores out in the tails. In practice, you'll find a lot of this sort of bell curve, but it's not that perfect idealized bell curve. Like for instance, grades in my class. When I look at grades for a quiz or a midterm, I always get a kind of bell curve, but it's not the perfect. It's not this ideal one. What I typically see is one with negative skew. Negative skew means that you have a tail in the low end. So if this was grades, typically, and I don't have any grades from this class, but at St. Mary's University, typically my average test grades are like a 65 to 75. And then there's a few people that do get higher grades. And then there's a lot of people, like there's a long tail with people who got like 30% and, 40%, 50%. There's more spread on the bottom. And in a way, there's a ceiling, right? You can't, if the average is, let's say 75, you can only go up so much from that, right? But you can go, it's not symmetrical. You can go lower than that. So if an average is 75, you only have 25 points. Right? There's a restricted range. If you get 100, that's 25 points higher. But you can get more than 25 points below 75. Right? You can get 50 points below 75. And there's a comment from Owen. In my organic chemistry class last year, the bell curve was a straight line. I don't quite understand. The bell curve was, it was a uniform distribution? So there were equal amounts of people getting all the different scores. There's a flat, that's called a uniform distribution. So there were just as many people who got 60 as 70 as 80 as 90. Yeah, that's called a uniform distribution. Sometimes there are uniform distributions. Okay, if you are picking, let's say you have a jar and there's marbles in the jar and you have an equal amount of red, green, and blue marbles, when you calculate the probability of pulling out a blue marble versus a yellow marble versus a red marble, that should be a uniform distribution. You shouldn't be way more likely to get red marbles. That might mean that you're peeking at the jar and picking the red ones. So this here is getting at the idea of range versus standard deviation. They communicate different things. The range just tells you the width of the distribution between minimum and maximum. And a distribution can have a lower standard deviation or a higher standard deviation. If I give a quiz where like most people end up getting a 75, most people have no deviation from the mean or very little deviation from the mean, right? It's a tight distribution that has a low standard deviation. But if there's a lot of spread, right, like in that uniform distribution, then you have the distribution would have a higher standard deviation and more variance on that score in the sample. When we take a little sample of undergraduate psychology students to do our research on, we hope to be able to generalize to the population. And that is a matter of inferential statistics, and that's a sort of a different game. And to do this properly, you need to be taking random samples from the population, and you know that we're not doing that, right? Okay. But let's imagine that it's a real world, that it is an ideal world, and we can get these random samples. Well, let's say that we're looking for a difference between, I'm doing a study on my therapy, and we're looking for a difference between the treatment and the control group. And let's say my therapy just doesn't work, okay? There's no difference. Well, there's an effective chance, and that effective chance is actually itself normally distributed. So let's say I'm doing this study many times over, not just once, then on average, most of my studies will find no difference. But sometimes I'll find it'll say that it looked like my treatment worked, okay? And sometimes out there on the tail, it looked like it had amazing results. This is why it's so dangerous to like base things on like one study. And sometimes it'll look like my treatment was harmful. And sometimes, but not very often, imagine if I repeated this study 1,000 times, it looks super harmful. But if I did all those studies and averaged the results, it would fall at 0. But so there is that probability of getting a statistically significant, of finding a result by chance alone. And the p-value, it's a mathematical statistical computation that you'll learn in second year, but it is the probability that you got a result that extreme. I need an invisible normal distribution. So let's say your finding is out here. It's the chance that you got a result that extreme or more extreme. And I put it in yellow because your textbook is wrong. I think your textbook says that it's the chance that you got that result if, assuming the null hypothesis is true. No, it's that result or one more extreme. And we accept up to a 5% chance that happened. Problem is that when we go and publish our research, we all want to publish the ones that had the positive results, right? So that's another way that bias comes in. Just because a result is statistically significant, which means that we believe that the result is reliable, right? That it's a real difference that will come up again when we repeat the study, doesn't mean that it's practically significant. So you could find a reliable difference that just doesn't matter in the real world. Okay, so statistical significance isn't the same thing as practical significance. When we report research in academic psychology, it goes through a review process where it's sent to a journal, and the journal sends it to a couple of reviewers. And they will give their opinion on it and decide sort of whether this should be published or not. And that's a gatekeeping function, and it does serve a good purpose, right? The other reviewers will catch flaws in your study, and they might say, no, this is too flawed, we shouldn't publish it, go back and fix it. It's also can be quite political, so there's things that are harder to publish and easier to publish. So if your study doesn't appeal to a reviewer because of their political bias, they might find things to pick on. Right? It can be very hard to publish qualitative research because there's a bias towards quantitative research, but qualitative research is still important. So the peer review process is important, but it's, like everything in psychology that involves humans, it has its limitations and can involve bias. Not a good idea to make broad inferences based on one study for so many reasons. So we have something called a systematic review, and that's when we go and we try to find all the research that's been done on a particular subject. I did, for my master's thesis, I did a systematic review on research about cyberbullying, because I wanted to find out kind of what's the prevalence rate of cyberbullying. I found that the best research wasn't in published studies. That was actually the most biased research. I found that the best research was done by school boards and not published in academic journals. And that's called the gray literature. So I'd say that a really good systematic review includes the gray literature as well. But a systematic review has a search strategy. Like, you describe what your search strategy is. How are you going to find these papers? Because otherwise, let's say you're sort of biased and you only read the papers that you like or that are published by the journals that are part of your echo chamber in psychology. And then there's a statistical method to combine the results from all of those studies. So let's say there's been research on my new form of therapy, and some of it, a lot of it finds null results, some of it finds positive results, some of it finds negative. There's a way of averaging that all out to say, hey, on the whole, it's a wash. Or on the whole, it looks like there is this treatment is beneficial. It's 10:20, but since we're on the last slide, I'm recording, I'll keep going here, so I might go a couple of minutes over time. Another way that we learn about scientific research is through the media, and there's reporting bias there as well. Media, people who are publishing in the popular press do want to get engagement. They want to get clicks. There might be advertising revenue. So overall, there's a bias to take a little study and exaggerate the results and run with it and kind of generate hype. And unfortunately, sometimes psychologists want to have their name in the media and be reported a lot. So sometimes they can, be part of that. So, they're kind of more and less sensational news sources, like that the tabloids like a lot of sensationalism, and then there's some news sources that are more modest in their reporting, say maybe the National Geographic or the New York Times. And but please be aware that when you're reading a news report on a scientific study, they've probably oversimplified things a lot. They've taken out a lot of the complexity. They're probably overgeneralized. Okay. And then another thing that sometimes reporters will do is they'll say, well, let's get let's get everyone's opinion on this. And so there's some things in psychology that aren't very controversial. So in psychology, we don't, on the whole, believe that vaccines cause autism. But if a journalist was studying this, they might say, well, to get a balanced perspective, let's go and interview some people who believe that it does. And then they might kind of give a lot more space to those folks than they really have in the discipline. So that ends chapter 2, and we're ahead of schedule. So Friday, take that time to study, and let's stick to the schedule and the syllabus and start chapter 3 on schedule on Monday. So thank you all for your attention. I'll hang around in case there are any questions. I'm going to stop the recording here.